Well, welcome everyone to our latest installment of Coffee and Hardtack. My name is Doug Damman. I'm the educational coordinator here at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We're so glad to have Dr. Rachel Sheldon from Penn State University with us today. Dr. Sheldon, welcome to Coffee and Hardtack.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sure, no problem. For those of you who have seen the series before, you know that this is a conversational piece, and we at the museum love reconnecting with authors or people in the public history realm or working in National Park Service sites or other historic sites who are doing incredibly interesting work in the Civil War field. So we look forward, Rachel, to getting to know you a little bit more today, learning about your work at Penn State and your work as an author as well.
Thanks.
I'm going to read Rachel's bio because it's very interesting, and I'm going to read it to make sure I get everything correct before we dive into our Q&A session. Dr. Rachel Sheldon is an associate professor of American history, specializing in the long Civil War era from the Jacksonian period through Reconstruction. Her research and teaching interests include slavery and abolitionists, the Civil War, the U.S. South, and political and constitutional history. She's the author of Washington Brotherhood, Politics, Social Life, and the Coming of the Civil War, something that we're going to dive into here in just a minute, which received honorable mention for the Wiley Silver Prize for the best first book on the American Civil War and was a selection of the History Book Club. A current project she's working on explores the political culture of the U.S. Supreme Court from the Jacksonian era to the 1890s. Before coming to Penn State, Dr. Sheldon taught at the University of Oklahoma, and she's also a native of Chicago that I just learned today. So Rachel, thank you so much again for joining us for our little get-together program.
It's my pleasure.
Now, to go back to the book, Washington Brotherhood, you describe it as a story of how one community, particularly Washington, D.C., understood the events, the political events of 1840 and 1850. And I think that community, the Washington, D.C. politicians, have been portrayed as rather adversarially, constantly at each other's throats, people carrying weapons, knives, revolvers into the Senate chambers, fist fights occurring. Do you think that stereotype fits historically the narrative that you found, or is that something that might have been overblown and is a bit overplayed?
Well, so it's a good question because there are ways in which it's not overblown and ways in which it is. So the way in which it's not overblown is that, of course, there was tons of violence in this period everywhere, not just in Washington, D.C. It was a pretty violent place to live, the United States. And so, people carried guns, people carried Bowie knives, people engaged with each other in hand-to-hand combat. But it wasn't just in Congress, it was everywhere. And so all the folks who would be in the House and Senate would have had experience with the violence of the country during that time. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that of course there is violence. It's just, is it different from the violence happening other places? One of the things I think we sometimes fall into as a trap is imagining the men of this time, the white men in Congress, as being two sides, right? Good and evil, the slaveholders and the non-slave holders, the people fighting for freedom and the people who are fighting for slavery. And that really is not the picture of what was happening in this time. It's really much greater spectrum. And of course, people are people. So they're going to engage with the people that they find really entertaining, the people that they get close to, and not just sort of the folks that are on their side. Although, we imagine that today because of the way Congress works, but, in the 21st century, but that's just not the way it worked then. People had to spend the entire session together. They couldn't go back and forth to their houses. And so they really, engaged with one another. And as a result, you end up with this group of folks who are engaging much more on a personal level. And even though it's violent, it doesn't mean that it is contentious in the way we imagine it to be.
So what were some of the ways that they did engage outside the halls of Congress or outside of their professional roles in Washington, D.C.? What did you find in your research?
So Washington, D.C. was sort of, again, a complicated place, in part because it was a really run down city. It wasn't, again, what we imagine today. It was dirty. There was only really one paved street during most of this time. People left their trash on the streets. It was not really a place for ladies. This is what the congressman would say, that women really shouldn't have to come to Washington, D.C. So is it, for the folks who were coming for the congressional session, they were really in their own bubble where they're not engaging as much with folks in the city itself. But so one thing that really brought people together was the social season that was put on sometimes by socialites in Washington, the upper class. Dolly Madison, for example, would put on parties and balls, and then of course the congressmen and members of the executive department and judiciary themselves. So the president would host a weekly or monthly levee, a big party essentially in the White House. The cabinet members would host, weekly get-togethers, sort of open houses. And so people would engage in these social situations and get a chance to chat with each other. There are also, much more informal dinner parties and gatherings. And then, of course, the bars and the gambling houses, which were very popular in this period. And so you ended up with these sort of social experiences. And you can imagine, if you were a congressman in this period and you were leaving your wife for 4 months, let's say, in one of your sessions, you might decide you want to go to the gambling house a little bit more than if your wife was around. And then you might tell your wife in a letter, oh, I know all these other folks who do it, but I would never do that.
That's somebody else. That's not not my scene down there. Sure.
That's right.
Now, did you find that politicians from both parties and from all over the United States were co-mingling at these engagements? I mean, they were, no matter your party affiliation or where you were from, you were generally invited to these engagements?
Yeah, so all the official events by the White House and the cabinet members were open to everyone, and people were expected to show up to these events. If you were going to serve in Congress, you were expected to participate in the social life of Congress. And so that included showing up so that people could see your face and get to know you and learn sort of where you stood on various issues. They provided the space for you to engage. And so as a result, everybody engages with this unless they don't have any desire to be involved really in Congress. So if you separate yourself from the social experience of Washington, it's much harder to have an influence because you don't know anyone well enough to be able to really push this agenda. And I should say, it just because people did engage cross-sectionally does not mean there weren't also groups who engaged, in sort of promoting their political ideals. So a couple of examples of this would be the Whigs during the 1840s would get together. Some members of the Whig Party would get together to discuss who they wanted the next presidential nominee to be. And so Abraham Lincoln was very involved with one group called the Young Indian Club, which he was part of sort of a debating society, but about 7 to 10 folks who got together to try to promote the idea of Zachary Taylor becoming the Whig nominee in 1848. You also had newspapermen who in this period were very, very engaged with politics. They were considered politicians in many ways. The newspapermen of the city would host various events. Gamaliel Bailey, who was the famous editor of the National Era, would host anti-slavery folks in his house. They had sort of salons in the weekend, but there were some, pro-slavery folks who would occasionally show up to these things. So you had sort of these opportunities to meet in smaller groups, but then also to participate in the broader social world.
You write in the book that the political fraternity and interaction helped forge some surprising friendships that crossed sectional and political boundaries. And I think of Lincoln and Alexander Stephens. They were, obviously very different from different parts of the country. They developed a friendship. Can you give us some other examples of that occurring? Some names that we might be surprised to know that these guys were pretty good friends behind the scenes.
Absolutely. So Stephens and Lincoln is my favorite too, because you can imagine these two sort of amusing folks. Lincoln had such a great sense of humor, and so Stephens, I think, was quite drawn to him. Stephens was also quite good pals with a bunch of other Northerners who happened to be sort of in the anti-slavery community, several of the Supreme Court justices, for example. Another really surprising one that I think would be people you would know in the audience would be William Henry Seward and Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy, William Henry Seward, future Secretary of State for the United States. And they had been quite good friends for some time. They lived close by to one another in houses in Washington. And Seward was very attentive to Davis at one point when Davis got quite ill. And so made pretty good friends with Davis and spent quite a bit of time with the Davises. And also another neighbor of his, Philip Phillips, who was a, sort of a brash lawyer from Alabama, and who was, very involved in Congress at this point.
Yeah. You mentioned the physical climate of Washington, D.C. in the summers. I used to live in Washington. I understand the heat and humidity there with air conditioning and paved roads, and that this was not an ideal place for families. It was almost a hardship, wasn't it, to be assigned to Washington, D.C. And often, as you said, the politicians didn't take their family members with them. They are transient, they are temporary residents there. How did the housing situation maybe help forge some of these political alliances or things that you saw going on at this time in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are three ways that you can find housing in Washington, D.C. in this period if you end up going to the city. One is to have a house where you rent a house, or maybe if you have enough money to buy a house, but this was very rare, in large part because it was very expensive and most of these congressmen did not make very much money. Almost all of them kept their side gigs, right, with their profession previously. So for example, Abraham Lincoln, when he came to Congress in the late 1840s, continued his law practice because this was the way that you made money. It was a happy coincidence that he could try a case in front of the Supreme Court during this period. Supreme Court, of course, being in the basement of the Capitol. So at the same time, you can be working on your legal profession and also engaging in Congress. So it was very unusual to have a house. The other two options were a hotel or a boarding house. Hotels, there were some really big ones in this period. The Willard Hotel, which still exists in Washington, was very popular. And then boarding houses usually were between 4 and 10 congressmen, senators would get together in a house. Sometimes Supreme Court justices also lived with them. And they would board, they would have their rooms, but they would also have their meals at these houses. And so, this was a really good way to create community in that these folks are eating dinner together every night. They're having breakfast together every morning. And so they get to know each other really well. And all of these boarding houses and hotels had the possibility for folks from both the North and the South to live. And a good portion of the boarding houses were cross-sectional, and all of the hotels were.
So through it all, it sounds like they had a much more deeper relationship than what we would think of as just kind of within the halls of Congress, and maybe a deeper friendship and understanding. How did all this come to be then? How did we get to a political impasse in 1860, 1861, obviously with secession? I mean, I know you write in your book, there's the theory of the bungling politicians, and that was kind of a debunked theory that some historians had about the Civil War, that it was caused by these inept politicians. Combo that with the newspapers kind of being the political mouthpiece, inflaming people's passions about this. How was it that this came to be and that compromise couldn't happen?
Well, so I think the real key there is to recognize that Congress did not have that much control. So we imagine the national government, the federal government, to have the control, right, over all of our lives in many ways. But this just wasn't true in the 19th century. And local and state politicians had a lot of control, and people on the ground, they engaged in their own ways. And so the congressmen in Washington they had one set of views about what was possible in terms of compromise, but their constituents weren't buying it. So they were really surprised. A lot of them were really surprised by the speed of secession and the way that communities back home in the South decided to mobilize in this way. So it was really a story of being unprepared. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't contribute to this in some way. One of the things that's really important to understand about Congress and why these relationships were so important outside the House and Senate is that a lot of what happened on the floor of the House and Senate was political theater. That should ring a bell to many of us today, right? That folks would give speeches that were not really for the people in the chambers. They would give speeches that could go in the congressional record, which was the record of the proceedings, or in newspapers back home. So, you would have a congressman who would get up and deliver a speech to a basically empty house with folks sort of sleeping on the couches on the side of the house, or there was a bar in the basement of the Capitol that people hung out at. And so, they'd give these speeches to basically no one. And then they'd spend hours creating copies of their speech to send home to go in the local newspaper. And there were even people who wrote speeches, did not deliver them, and had them inserted into the Congressional Globe. So they create a lot of the anger because, of course, it's very good political theater to criticize Southerners or criticize Northerners. And, by the time you get to the late 1850s and you have the Republicans specifically giving anti-South speeches, that is going to be really inflaming. Now, that's not to suggest that they're responsible for the Civil War. I don't want to return to the blundering generation idea, but they are not really controlling anything. They think they are, but they're not really controlling anything.
That's very interesting. Beyond your career as an author with the book, you're also the director of the Richard Civil War Era Center at Penn State University. Can you tell our viewers about the mission and work of the center with your undergraduate students at Penn State? Where can we maybe encounter some of these students as they're out working in a public history field, and really your day-to-day operations there at Penn State with the center?
Yeah, so we're an academic center, which means that we are primarily focused on producing academic work and training scholars. But as part of that, we produce a journal, the Journal of the Civil War Era, which is an important journal in the field of Civil War studies. And we also have graduate fellowships and postdoctoral fellowships. And then we also host an internship program for students at Harper's Ferry and Gettysburg. And we work with the folks in these institutions to provide the opportunity for undergraduates to really experience what public history is like. Our main goal is to create more knowledge about the Civil War era. And one of the ways that we do that is to educate undergraduates, but it's also to produce more knowledge that we can then deliver to the public in other ways. So, lots of our folks who are affiliated write for the Washington Post and the New York Times, just to sort of deliver the kinds of things that are going on in their classrooms and in their scholarly work. We're not really a place to visit, but you'll see us pop up in lots of different places.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, we really enjoyed this time with you. I thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to join us for Coffee and Hardtack.
My pleasure.
And my hope is that your research and or travel will bring you back to the Chicagoland area, to Kenosha, and we'd love to host you here for either a program or just a visit to come and see the museum and check out what we're all about here on site.
I'd love to do both. Thanks so much.
You bet. Take care. Have a great summer.
You too.
Bye-bye.